Frontier fortresses were never just walls. They were the engines that drove empires forward, not the shields that held them back. By the end of this journey, through 30 remarkable fortresses across continents and centuries, you will see how each one reveals a different mechanism of expansion through control of trade, projection of military power, or subtle cultural influence. Why did a single star-shaped fort on a frozen lake decide the fate of a continent? How did a wooden stockade in the middle of nowhere become the seed of a global city? And what does it take for a structure to become more than stone and mortar? Hadrian's wall was never meant to keep everyone out. Stretching for 73 miles across northern Britain, this Roman frontier was a masterwork of controlled access, not a crude barrier. It functioned more like a customs checkpoint than a fortress wall. Soldiers stationed in its mile castles and watchtowers monitored every traveler, every trader, every herd of cattle moving south or north. They collected taxes on goods, issued permits for passage, and denied entry to anyone deemed a threat. The wall projected Roman authority into a landscape that had long resisted it, but it did so by managing movement rather than blocking it entirely. By turning the frontier into a regulated zone, Rome pacified a volatile region without committing to endless campaigns. The wall allowed the empire to project power deeper into Caledonia through a network of forward outposts, roads, and supply depots that extended well beyond the Stone Curtain. In fact, some of the most telling evidence of Roman ambition lies in those advance forts, built not to defend the wall but to push the frontier further. Hadrian's wall proves that a wall, when designed as a gateway rather than a dead end, can enable expansion as much as it contains it. This paradox appears again and again in the history of empires, where a well-placed structure on a seemingly defensive line becomes the springboard for the next leap forward. The Great Wall of China was never a single wall but a series of layered barriers that grew over centuries. Under the Ming dynasty, this vast network became something far more strategic than a line of defense. It was a tool of border management and population control, designed not just to keep northern nomadic groups out but to keep agricultural societies in. By controlling checkpoints and passes, the Ming government could monitor who crossed, what goods moved, and where people settled. This allowed them to consolidate the population within a defined territory, reducing the risk of unrest or unregulated migration. With a stable interior, the empire could divert military resources away from constant border skirmishes and toward internal development and, eventually, expansion into Central Asia. The wall also protected the Silk Road, securing the trade routes that brought wealth and ideas from distant lands. Where Hadrian's wall was a 73-mile customs gate, the Great Wall stretched for thousands of miles across mountains and deserts, yet both served the same fundamental purpose: to regulate movement, project authority, and enable expansion through controlled access. The Ming Wall did not simply block, it canalized. It created a buffer zone where merchants passed, tribute was exchanged, and intelligence flowed. In this sense, the wall was a spine for imperial growth, letting the empire push outward into the steppes with fewer worries about its rear. The sheer scale of the project also established a lasting symbol of unity, reminding every community within the borders of a single, shared frontier. That idea of a collective boundary, even if the actual wall was often porous, helped forge a common identity over time. Far to the south, another fortress rose from the desert as a statement of power and partnership. Masada was not built by an invading army but by King Herod, a client ruler who owed his throne to Rome. Perched on a rugged plateau overlooking the Dead Sea, This fortress was a marvel of engineering and a clear message to anyone who saw it. Herod filled its storehouses with grain, wine, and weapons, and equipped it with cisterns that could hold millions of gallons of water. He built palaces, bathhouses, and a synagogue, making Masada a place of both luxury and defense. But its true purpose went beyond personal safety. Masada sat at a strategic crossroads, controlling the routes that carried spices and incense from the Red Sea northward. By securing this position, Herod helped Rome dominate the lucrative trade networks of the region without committing legions to every mile. The fortress also served as a base for Roman-aligned forces to monitor and suppress unrest among local populations, keeping the peace in a volatile frontier zone. Rome did not need to station a permanent garrison in every desert village when a single fortress like Masada could project authority across a wide territory. That arrangement worked well during Herod's lifetime, but after his passing, the fortress changed hands and took on a new role in one of the most famous episodes of Roman Judean history. What happened there later turned Masada into something far more than a strategic outpost. It became a powerful symbol of resistance, a story that shaped imperial narratives for centuries to come. For the empire that built it, the fortress was a tool of control and commerce. For those who later held it, it became a place of last stand and memory. That duality is part of what makes Masada so fascinating. It reveals how a structure designed to maintain order can later become a flashpoint for a very different kind of story. And in that shift, we see how fortresses often outlive their original purpose to become emblems of identity and defiance. The legacy of Masada reminds us that the walls empires build can end up meaning something entirely different to those who come after, especially when the empire itself is gone. Off the coast of East Africa, a star-shaped fortress still stands watch over the Indian Ocean. Fort Jesus, built by the Portuguese in 1593, was not designed to repel a land army. Its walls were arranged so that cannons could fire in every direction, commanding the sea lanes that funneled spices, gold, ivory, and slaves between Africa, India, and the Middle East. The fortress sat on Mombasa Island, controlling the natural harbor where monsoon winds forced ships to stop. Any vessel that wanted to trade along that coast had to pass within range of its guns, and the Portuguese charged a tax for the privilege. They called this system the cart, as a permit that all merchants had to purchase before sailing. Without it, a ship risked seizure or destruction. By enforcing this monopoly from a single strong point, Portugal could dominate the Indian Ocean without needing a massive navy patrolling every route. Fort Jesus was the lock on a door that opened only for those who paid. The structure itself was a masterpiece of Renaissance military engineering, with thick coral stone walls, angled bastions, and a deep, dry moat. It was designed to withstand a siege for months, with cisterns and storehouses that could keep a garrison alive while waiting for reinforcements from Goa. But the Portuguese hold on East Africa was never absolute. Over the centuries, Fort Jesus changed hands many times. Local Swahili rulers allied with the Omani Arabs to drive the Portuguese out in the late 1600s, and the Omanis held the fort for more than a century. Later, the British took control during their colonial expansion, and eventually the fort became a symbol of Kenyan heritage. Each new power left its mark on the walls, carving inscriptions, adding structures, or repairing damage from bombardments. This constant turnover reflects the reality of imperial trade networks. They are only as strong as the fortress that protects them, and that fortress can become a prize that others are willing to fight for. Today, Fort Jesus stands as a museum, a reminder of how a single structure could command the flow of wealth across an ocean. Its story shows that when you build a fortress to control commerce, you also build a target for everyone who wants that commerce for themselves. And in the centuries of struggle over that one star-shaped outpost, we see a larger truth about empires. The same fort that enables expansion also invites the forces that will one day replace it. On the windswept coast of Texas, a single fort changed the destiny of a continent. Fort St. Louis was not designed to hold a major territory. It was a small outpost, hastily built by French explorer René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, in 1685. La Salle had grand ambitions. He aimed to establish a French colony at the mouth of the Mississippi River, a gateway to the interior of North America that would give France control over the vast fur trade and a direct route to Mexico. But his navigation was off. He missed the Mississippi entirely and landed hundreds of miles to the west on the barren shoreline of present-day Texas. There, on a low bluff overlooking Matagorda Bay, his colonists constructed a crude wooden fort with a few cannon and a palisade. The location was terrible. The soil was poor, the local peoples were wary, and supplies from France rarely arrived. Within a few years, disease and conflict reduced the colony to a handful of survivors. La Salle himself was killed by his own men during an overland journey to seek help. By 1689, the fort was abandoned, its remaining inhabitants scattered or captured. By any measure, Fort St. Louis was a complete failure. It never secured a trade route, never attracted settlers, and never served as a base for French expansion. Yet its existence had consequences far beyond its brief life. Spanish authorities in Mexico had long claimed the entire Gulf Coast, but they had done little to settle it. When they learned that a French fort had been built on what they considered their territory, they reacted with alarm. The Spanish crown dispatched multiple expeditions to locate and destroy the intruders. They found only the ruins of Fort St. Louis, but the scare did not end there. To prevent future French incursions, Spain began a serious effort to colonize Texas. They established missions and presidios, or military garrisons, across the region, founding settlements that would later become cities like San Antonio and Nacogdoches. The abandoned French outpost, though tiny and short-lived, triggered a chain of events that led Spain to invest heavily in a frontier it had previously ignored. In this way, a failed fortress became a catalyst for expansion, not for the empire that built it, but for the rival empire that feared it. The strategic miscalculation of La Salle, landing in the wrong place, ironically had a greater impact than any successful French colony could have achieved. It forced Spain to commit resources, build infrastructure, and plant the seeds of a permanent Spanish presence in a region that might otherwise have remained a neglected borderland. Fort St. Louis shows us that even the weakest fortress can shape history, not through its own strength, but through the fears it awakens. The walls that crumble are sometimes the ones that leave the deepest mark. The forks of the Ohio River were a strategic prize that no empire could ignore. 3 rivers converged there, creating a natural gateway into the vast Ohio Valley, a region rich with fur, fertile land, and potential trade routes. The French recognized this long before the British. In 1754, they built Fort Duquesne at that exact junction, a modest wooden fort with earthen ramparts and a garrison of about 100 soldiers. It was not massive or heavily armed, but its position gave France a lever to control the entire watershed. From this outpost, French forces could patrol the riverways, intercept British traders moving west, and forge alliances with local indigenous nations who already dominated the region. The fort was a classic forward base, planted aggressively on contested ground to claim territory before a rival could secure it. French officials understood that whoever controlled the forks controlled access to the interior, and they were determined to keep the British east of the Appalachian Mountains. The British colonies, however, saw the Ohio Valley as their natural westward frontier. Land speculators and settlers had already begun pushing beyond the mountains, and they viewed Fort Duquesne as an obstacle to their growth. when a young Virginia militia officer named George Washington led a small expedition to confront the French in 1754. His skirmish with a French patrol near the fort triggered a chain of events that exploded into a global conflict. The French and Indian War, as it was known in North America, was the final contest between France and Britain for control of the continent. Fort Duquesne became a flashpoint, a symbol of French resolve and British frustration. For years, British attempts to capture the fort failed, and French forces used it as a base for raids that disrupted British settlements along the frontier. But the tide turned in 1758 when a larger British force, supported by colonial militia and indigenous allies, marched on the forts. The French, outnumbered and cut off from supply lines, chose to destroy the fort and withdraw. When the British arrived, they found only smoldering ruins. They immediately began construction of their own fortress on the same ground, naming it Fort Pitt after the British Prime Minister. That new fort was far larger, built of stone and earth, with bastions designed to withstand a modern siege. It became the nucleus of a settlement that would grow into the city of Pittsburgh. The transition from Fort Duquesne to Fort Pitt illustrates a core pattern of imperial expansion. A forward base planted by one power to claim a region is captured or replaced by a rival, who then uses the same strategic position to push even deeper. The fort that once blocked British expansion became the springboard for British dominance of the Ohio Valley, and later for American westward settlement. In the end, the contest over a single fort at the forks of the Ohio did not just decide the fate of that valley. It reshaped the entire map of North America, clearing the way for a new nation to emerge from the conflict. The stone star of Fort Ticonderoga sat directly across the narrowest point of Lake Champlain, a natural highway between New France and the British colonies. Whoever held that fortress controlled the only practical water route for moving armies and supplies between the St. Lawrence Valley and the Hudson River. The lake was like a long, deep arrow pointing straight at the heart of the continent, and Ticonderoga was the stone tip of that arrow. The French built it in 1755, during the same buildup that created Fort Duquesne to the west, and they gave it the name Carillon, after the sound of the nearby waterfall that reminded soldiers of chiming bells. Its walls were not tall stone curtains but low, thick ramparts of earth and stone, angled into a five-pointed star. Every side of that star offered overlapping fields of fire, so attackers approaching from any direction faced cannon and musket shot from multiple angles at once. This design, known as the Star Fort or Trace Italien, was a response to the growing power of artillery. High medieval walls crumbled under cannon fire, but low, sloped bastions deflected shot, and the star shape eliminated blind spots where attackers could shelter. Fort Ticonderoga was a textbook example of this military engineering, perfectly fitted to its rocky peninsula where the lake narrowed. The French garrison numbered only a few hundred men, but the fort itself was a force multiplier. In 1758, a much larger British army attempted to capture it. The French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm, used the fort's defenses and a clever field fortification of felled trees, a huge abatis, to repel the assault with devastating losses. The British withdrew and Ticonderoga seemed invincible. But that reputation changed just 1 year later. The British returned with a new commander and a new strategy, landing troops north of the fort and dragging cannon overland to heights that overlooked the star. The French, fearing encirclement, abandoned the fort and blew up its powder magazine as they withdrew. The British marched in and renamed it Ticonderoga, a word borrowed from the Mohawk language meaning at the junction of two waterways. For the rest of the French and Indian War, the fort served as a British staging ground for campaigns into Canada. Its value as a choke point did not end with one conflict. 2 decades later, during the American Revolution, the fort changed hands again. In May of 1775, a small force of American colonists led by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold surprised the sleeping British garrison and captured it without firing a shot. The Americans hauled its heavy cannon east to Boston, where they forced the British to evacuate the city. Ticonderoga had become a supply depot for the American cause. But in 1777, British forces returned and easily took the fort from the Americans, who had neglected its defenses. That loss was a blow to American morale, but it also showed how a fortress only remained powerful as long as its defenders understood its purpose. When the Americans regained it later in the war, Fort Ticonderoga was no longer the strategic prize it had once been, because the war had moved south. The story of this single star-shaped fort reveals a pattern that repeats across the frontier fortresses of North America. Control of a narrow water route could decide the fate of a campaign, and a well-designed fort at the right spot could make one army seem invincible and another helpless. But a fort is only as strong as the will and resources of those who hold it, and Ticonderoga, sitting quietly at the junction of two waterways, would outlive the empires that fought over it, becoming a monument to the idea that geography is destiny and that even a stone star can be the hinge on which history turns. A former mission in southern Texas became the most famous rallying cry in American history. The Alamo began its life not as a fortress but as a place of worship, Mission San Antonio de Valero, built by Spanish missionaries in the early 1700s to spread Christianity among the local indigenous population. As Spanish power waned and Mexico gained independence in 1821, the mission was secularized and eventually abandoned. Its thick stone walls and open courtyard, however, made it easy to convert into a makeshift fort. By the 1830s, Texas was a Mexican frontier province struggling with tensions between the central government in Mexico City and the growing number of Anglo-American settlers who had moved in under promises of land and autonomy. Those settlers wanted more self-rule, while Mexican President Antonio López de Santa Anna moved to centralize authority and tighten control. In 1835, open rebellion broke out, and Texan forces captured the Alamo from the Mexican garrison stationed there. The complex now served as a stronghold for the rebels, a symbol of their defiance. Santa Anna was determined to crush the uprising. He marched north with a large army in early 1836, arriving at the Alamo in late February. Inside the walls, a small force of about 200 Texan defenders, including famous figures like William B. Travis, James Bowie, and Davy Crockett, decided to hold the position. They knew they were outnumbered. Reinforcements were unlikely to arrive in time, but the mission walls offered cover, and the defenders hoped to delay the Mexican advance long enough for the main Texan army to organize. For 13 days, Santa Anna's forces bombarded the fort and launched assaults that were beaten back. Finally, on the morning of March 6th, Mexican troops stormed the walls from multiple sides. The battle inside the compound was fierce and short. By sunrise, nearly all the defenders had lost their lives. The fall of the Alamo was a devastating military setback for the Texan cause. But its impact went far beyond the loss of those men. News of the siege and the final engagement spread quickly across Texas and the United States. The story of a small garrison making a stand against overwhelming odds captured the imagination of a wide audience. The phrase "Remember the Alamo" became a battle cry that galvanized volunteers and motivated the Texan army. Just 6 weeks later, at the Battle of San Jacinto, Texan forces shouting that rallying cry defeated Santa Anna's army in a surprise attack and secured Texan independence. The Alamo itself was destroyed in the fighting, its walls left in ruins for years, but those ruins became a shrine. The symbolic defeat turned into an engine of expansion. It fueled the desire for Texas to join the United States, which happened in 1845, and it later inspired American expansion further west. The Alamo showed that a lost fortress could be more valuable than a won battle. its memory became a force that shaped a nation's boundaries and identity. And in that transformation, we see how the story of a fort can sometimes outweigh the stone it was built from. In the heart of Wyoming, a different kind of fortress reshaped a continent. Fort Laramie began its life in 1834 as a private fur trading post built by a company of trappers and merchants. They called it Fort William, a simple stockade of cottonwood logs set against the vast emptiness of the high plains. For nearly a decade, it served as a gathering place where native hunters brought buffalo robes and beaver pelts to exchange for guns, blankets, and iron tools. The trade was rough and seasonal, and the fort was just a speck on a map of unclaimed land. But the westward momentum of the United States was already building, and the fort sat at a crossroads that would soon become the most traveled corridor in the continent. The Oregon Trail, the main route for settlers heading to the Pacific Northwest, passed right by its gates. In 1849, the U.S. Army purchased the fort and renamed it Fort Laramie. The Army expanded it with adobe barracks, a stone guardhouse, a hospital, and a quartermaster depot. Suddenly, this isolated post became a lifeline. Wagon trains of families, merchants, and fortune-seekers stopped here to rest their livestock, repair broken wheels, buy supplies, and send letters home. The fort was a resupply hub, a post office, and a blacksmith shop all in one. Without it, the journey across the plains would have been far more dangerous. But Fort Laramie was never just a way station. It was also a place where the United States government tried to manage its relationships with the Plains nations. The famous Horse Creek Treaty of 1851 was negotiated near the fort, an attempt to define territorial boundaries between various native groups and to guarantee safe passage for settlers along the trail. The government promised annuities of food, goods, and tools in exchange for peace. For a few years, the system held. Hundreds of thousands of travelers passed through Fort Laramie, and the fort became a symbol of order on the frontier. But the treaty was built on a fragile assumption that the vast herds of bison and the open range would always be enough for everyone. As more settlers poured west, the balance tipped. Grasslands were overgrazed, bison were hunted in enormous numbers, conflicts over resources grew more frequent. Fort Laramie shifted from a friendly trading post to a military outpost tasked with enforcing the government's will. Soldiers patrolled the trail, escorted wagon trains, and responded to reports of violence. The fort also became a site of negotiation and coercion, where native leaders were summoned to sign new treaties that often forced them onto smaller reservations. The story of Fort Laramie is not just one of American expansion. It is a story of how a single fort could facilitate the movement of hundreds of thousands of people, reshaping the demographic map of an entire region. Each wagon that rolled past its gates carried a family with hopes for land and opportunity. Those families transformed the prairies into farms and towns, displacing the very societies that had lived there for generations. The fortress itself was not a weapon. It was a door that swung open for settlers and swung shut for others. And like so many frontier forts, it became a place where the tensions of expansion were concentrated, a place where treaties were signed and broken, where promises were made and forgotten. Today, Fort Laramie is a National Historic Site, its old stone buildings standing quietly in the Wyoming wind. Visitors walk through the same gate that once welcomed thousands of travelers. They see the blacksmith shop, the hospital, the officers' quarters. But the deeper story is invisible, written in the dust of the trail, in the ledger books of the quartermaster, in the fading ink of treaties that tried and failed to freeze a living landscape into lines on a map. Fort Laramie reminds us that a fortress on a frontier does more than defend. It channels movement, it concentrates power, and it can become the hinge between two worlds, swinging one way and then the other, until the landscape itself is changed forever. On the Columbia River, a fur trading post quietly reshaped an entire border. Fort Vancouver was not built by soldiers or designed for cannon fire. It was the headquarters of the Hudson's Bay Company, a business empire that controlled the fur trade across a vast region stretching from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. The fort itself was a modest wooden stockade surrounded by fields, orchards, and workshops. Inside, clerks kept ledgers in careful handwriting while workers processed beaver pelts, tanned leather, and packed goods for shipment to London. Outside, a small village of laborers, French-Canadian voyageurs, native families, and mixed heritage communities grew up around the walls. The fort was a hub, not a fortress. But its power was immense. The Hudson's Bay Company did not need an army to dominate the Pacific Northwest because it controlled the economy. Every trap, every trade, every shipment of furs passed through its system. Local indigenous nations brought beaver pelts to the fort in exchange for wool blankets, metal tools, firearms, and beads. The company set the prices, extended credit, and maintained relationships through marriage alliances and annual gift-giving. In this way, Fort Vancouver projected British influence into a region that the United States also claimed, without firing a single shot. The fort became the center of a network of smaller trading posts and supply routes that reached deep into what is now Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and British Columbia. British authority was felt not through military garrisons but through the steady rhythm of commerce. This economic control was so effective that for decades, the Hudson's Bay Company effectively governed a territory larger than many European nations. But the contest with the United States over the Oregon country could not be settled by trade alone. By the 1840s, American settlers were pouring over the Oregon Trail, and the political pressure for a boundary grew intense. In 1846, the Oregon Treaty established the 49th parallel as the border between British and American territory. Fort Vancouver, which sat on the north bank of the Columbia River, found itself on the American side. The Hudson's Bay Company had already begun shifting its operations north to Fort Victoria on Vancouver Island. In 1860, the company formally handed over Fort Vancouver to the United States Army, which renamed it Vancouver Barracks. The old fur trading post became a military base, and the landscape around it slowly transformed into the city of Vancouver, Washington. What makes Fort Vancouver so instructive is how easily economic influence can precede political control. The British did not need to garrison the Columbia River with warships because they had already woven themselves into the fabric of the region's commerce. When the border finally came, it followed the path of least resistance, drawn along a line that reflected decades of quiet dominance. The fort's handover was not a defeat but a negotiation, a recognition that the balance of settlers had shifted. In that moment, a commercial fortress surrendered its role to a new national frontier, and yet the legacy of that peaceful expansion lingers. The fort itself has been reconstructed as a living history site, where visitors can smell the smoke from the blacksmith's forge and watch bakers prepare bread in the old ovens. They walk through the same gates where voyageurs once carried bundles of furs worth a fortune, and they see how an empire built on trade rather than conquest could shape a continent, not by walls and cannon, but by ledger books and beaver pelts. High on a wind-swept bluff above the Pacific Ocean, a small Russian outpost once flew the imperial double eagle over California. Fort Ross was founded in 1812 by the Russian-American Company, a state-sponsored trading enterprise that had already established a fur empire in Alaska. The problem was simple and desperate. Alaskan colonies needed food. The cold climate and short growing season made it nearly impossible to grow enough grain or raise enough livestock to sustain the settlers and the indigenous workers who harvested sea otters for their luxurious pelts. Shipments from Russia took years to arrive and often spoiled, so the company looked south to the fertile coast of California, then controlled by Spain but only loosely settled. They built Fort Ross on land they bought or leased from the local Kashayapomo people, a transaction that historians still study for what it reveals about cross-cultural diplomacy. The fort itself was a sturdy wooden stockade with blockhouses at each corner, armed with cannon and surrounded by gardens, orchards, and grain fields. Inside, Russian managers lived alongside native Alaskan hunters, Creole families, and workers from various backgrounds. The fort became a hub for a surprising enterprise. Russian ships sailed south to hunt sea otters along the California coast, nearly driving the animal to local extinction. They traded with Spanish missions for cattle and grain, and they built a small shipyard that launched vessels for the Pacific trade. The Russians also established relationships with the local native communities, sometimes trading goods, sometimes employing them, and sometimes clashing over resources. The Kashayapomo, for instance, worked as laborers and shared knowledge of the land, but they also faced disruption to their traditional ways. Fort Ross was never a purely military fortress. It was a commercial outpost with a defensive perimeter, a place where empire expanded not through conquest but through economic necessity, and for a few decades it worked. The colony grew wheat, raised sheep, and produced enough food to send north to Sitka, the Russian capital in Alaska, but the venture always teetered on the edge of profitability. Sea otters grew scarce. The Spanish, and later the Mexicans after their independence, grew wary of Russian presence so close to their settlements. The overland supply routes were long and vulnerable. By the 1830s, the Russian-American company realized that maintaining Fort Ross cost more than it returned. They tried to sell the fort to the Hudson's Bay Company and then to the United States, but no deal materialized. Finally, in 1841, the Russians packed up their equipment, dismantled what they could, and sold the remaining buildings and land to a Swiss immigrant named John Sutter, who would later become famous for another frontier story entirely. With that sale, the Russian dream of a warm water colony in California faded. The fort itself slowly decayed, its wooden walls weathering under the California sun. Today, Fort Ross is a state historic park, its reconstructed buildings offering a glimpse of a forgotten chapter. What makes this fortress so revealing is not its military might, for it had little, but the reason it existed in the first place. Russia stretched its empire across an entire ocean to plant a tiny agricultural colony on a foreign shore, all because its Alaskan settlements could not feed themselves. That is the logic of Overstretch. An empire extends itself to support a distant outpost, and then must extend itself further to support that extension. When the costs finally outweigh the benefits, the whole structure contracts. Fort Ross marks the furthest point of that contraction, a place where the imperial tide reached its high water mark and then receded, leaving behind only a few weathered timbers and a story about the limits of ambition. On the southwestern shore of Lake Michigan, another outpost marked the beginning of something much larger. Fort Dearborn was established in 1803, just a few years after the United States took control of the region following the treaties that ended earlier conflicts. Its location was no accident. The soil here was marshy and the winters brutal, but the land held a secret that made it invaluable. A few miles inland, a short portage connected the Chicago River, which flowed into Lake Michigan, to the Des Plaines River, which eventually reached the Mississippi. This narrow strip of mud and grass was the only break in the vast water highway that linked the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Any traveler moving goods from the Atlantic coast to the interior had to cross that portage. Anyone who controlled it could tax, regulate, or block that movement. So the American government built a small wooden stockade with blockhouses at the corners, garrisoned by a few dozen soldiers, and named it after Henry Dearborn, the Secretary of War at the time. The fort was not designed to repel a full invasion. It was a presence, a claim made visible, a sign that the United States intended to hold this strategic ground. For the first decade of its existence, Fort Dearborn was a lonely outpost surrounded by prairie and marsh. The garrison traded with local Potawatomi villages, repaired their muskets, and forwarded dispatches between Detroit and the frontier posts to the west. Life was routine and isolated, but in the War of 1812 that peace shattered. A larger conflict between the United States and Britain drew in native nations allied with the British, and Fort Dearborn found itself exposed. The American commander, fearing attack, ordered the fort abandoned and the garrison to evacuate to Fort Wayne. As the soldiers, settlers, and a small militia marched out along the lakeshore, they were caught by a force of Potawatomi warriors. The encounter was intense and the outcome tragic. The fort itself was burned to the ground. For a few years, the site sat empty, a charred reminder of the fragility of American expansion. But the war ended, and the United States was determined to secure its interior. In 1816, a new Fort Dearborn rose from the ashes. This time, the fort was sturdier, with stronger palisades and a more permanent garrison. The soldiers rebuilt not just the walls but the entire network of relationships with the surrounding communities. They repaired the portage trail, built a bridge over the Chicago River, and constructed a mill for grinding grain. Slowly, the outpost attracted civilians. Traders set up shops near the fort. Farmers cleared land to the west and south. A small settlement began to cluster around the stockade. By the 1830s, the village had grown into a bustling town, and the town was renamed Chicago. The fort itself was decommissioned in 1837, its military role replaced by the city it had helped create. The blockhouses were torn down, the parade ground subdivided into streets, and the land absorbed into the expanding grid of a metropolis that would one day become one of the largest cities in North America. Fort Dearborn is a perfect example of how a fortress could function as a siege. The strategic logic that placed it at the portage did not disappear when the garrison left. The portage remained crucial, and later a canal was dug to bypass it entirely, connecting Lake Michigan to the Mississippi more efficiently. Railroads then converged on the same point. The city grew because the location was vital, but the fort was the first permanent structure that said, "This place matters." Without that initial outpost, the settlement might have taken decades longer to take root. Instead, the fort acted like a magnet, drawing people, capital, and infrastructure to a swampy lakeshore that otherwise held little appeal. In this way, the story of Fort Dearborn is also the story of how empires plant forts not just to defend territory, but to create it. The fort did not just secure the portage, it made the portage into a gateway and the gateway into a city. When we walk through the streets of downtown Chicago today, we are walking over a ground that was once a parade ground, over soil that held the footprints of soldiers and traders who had no idea their isolated outpost would become the crossroads of a continent. And that is the quiet power of the frontier fortress. It starts as a claim, a small wooden statement in an empty place. And then, if the conditions are right, it becomes the center of something no one could have predicted. At the junction of three rivers, a different kind of fortress laid the foundation for an industrial empire. Fort Pitt rose from the ashes of Fort Duquesne in 1758, built by the British on the same ground where the French had tried and failed to hold the Ohio country. The location was no accident. Three waterways, the Allegheny, the Monongahela, and the Ohio, converged here, creating a natural crossroads that funneled trade goods, military supplies, and people from the eastern seaboard deep into the interior. Any empire that wanted to control the vast territory west of the Appalachians had to hold this point. So the British built a fortress unlike any wooden stockade that had come before. Fort Pitt was a massive earth and stone structure, a pentagon shape with bastions at each corner, surrounded by a deep ditch and a glacis that sloped outward to deflect cannon fire. Its walls were thick enough to withstand a siege, and its guns commanded the rivers for miles in both directions. But what made Fort Pitt truly transformative was not its military strength. It was the economic engine that the British built inside those walls. The same fort that housed soldiers also housed traders, merchants, and craftsmen. The British government encouraged the establishment of a trading post within the fort, where native nations could bring furs, pelts, and hides to exchange for wool blankets, iron kettles, muskets, gunpowder, and cloth. The trade was regulated and taxed, but it was also steady and profitable. The fort became a magnet for commerce. Thousands of deer and beaver skins passed through its gates each year, and the flow of goods attracted settlers who built homes, shops, and taverns just outside the walls. The village that grew up around Fort Pitt was called Pittsburgh, named after the British Prime Minister who had authorized the fort's construction. Within a few decades, the military garrison became less important than the bustling town that surrounded it. The fort itself was eventually decommissioned, but the city kept expanding. The same rivers that had made the location a strategic stronghold now made it a transportation hub for the new nation. Coal and iron deposits in the surrounding hills turned Pittsburgh into a center of industry, and the old fortress walls were buried under factories, warehouses, and bridges. What remains of Fort Pitt today is a small blockhouse, one of the few original structures still standing, tucked away in a city park near the point where the rivers meet. Visitors can walk through that tiny brick building and try to imagine the scale of what once stood there. Fort Pitt teaches us that a frontier fortress is never just a military outpost. It is a seed of economic activity, a place where the logistics of trade become as important as the logistics of war. The same walls that protected soldiers also protected merchants, and the same gates that allowed troops to march out also allowed wagons of goods to roll in. In that convergence of river and commerce, we see how a fortress designed for conquest can become a city built for connection. And Pittsburgh, with its steel mills and skyscrapers, is the living monument to that transformation, a reminder that the greatest legacy of a frontier stronghold is sometimes the city that grows in its shadow. Far up the Missouri River, a different kind of fortress operated without a single soldier. Fort Union was not built by the United States Army. It was erected in 1828 by the American Fur Company, a private enterprise that saw profit where the government saw only wilderness. The company selected a site near the confluence of the Missouri and the Yellowstone rivers, a spot where steamboats could unload cargo and where the trade routes of several native nations converged. The fort itself was a large rectangle of cottonwood logs with two blockhouses at opposite corners and a central gate that could be barred at night. Inside, the courtyard held a trading house, a blacksmith shop, a warehouse, and living quarters for the traders and their families. Outside, the prairie stretched in every direction, empty of any permanent settlement but full of movement. Birch bark canoes, bull boats made of buffalo hide, and horse-mounted parties all arrived at the fort carrying furs from the vast watershed of the upper Missouri. The traders at Fort Union did not demand taxes or issue permits. They offered goods, wool blankets, iron axes, copper kettles, cloth, beads, and later, guns and ammunition were laid out on the counter. A native hunter could bring a stack of beaver pelts or a bundle of buffalo robes and exchange them for items that made life on the plains easier or more prestigious. The negotiation was often prolonged, with speeches, gifts, and feasts smoothing the way. The fort became a gathering place, a neutral ground where different nations could meet, trade, and talk. The Crow, the Blackfeet, the Assiniboine, the Sioux, and the Mandan all passed through its gates, sometimes warily, sometimes as friends. The traders learned the languages, adopted local customs, and married into the communities they worked with. Fort Union was not a place of conquest. It was a place of exchange, but that exchange had a powerful effect. Every beaver pelt that left the fort on a steamboat bound for St. Louis was a thread in a growing web that tied the upper Missouri to the American economy. The more furs that flowed down river, the more American goods flowed back, and the more the native nations became accustomed to those goods. Over time, the trade created dependencies. A tribe that relied on iron arrowheads or steel traps could not easily go back to stone and bone, and the American Fur Company, with its network of forts up and down the river, became the primary source of those vital items. That gave the company enormous influence and, by extension, gave the United States a foothold in a region it had not yet formally claimed. The government did not need to send soldiers to fortify the Missouri because the company had already built relationships that served the same purpose. Explorers and naturalists also stopped at Fort Union. The artist George Catlin came to paint portraits of Plains leaders. The naturalist John James Audubon visited to study birds. Government surveyors used the fort as a base for mapping the territory. In this way, the private fortress became a hub of scientific and cultural knowledge as well as commerce. It was a place where the frontier was being documented even as it was being transformed. But the system that made Fort Union thrive was fragile. By the middle of the 19th century, beaver populations had declined sharply due to overtrapping, and fashion in Europe shifted away from beaver felt hats. The fur trade contracted, and the American Fur Company began to struggle. At the same time, the United States government started to take a more active role in the region. Army forts were built nearby, and treaties were imposed that restricted native movement. The informal diplomacy of the trading post gave way to the formal authority of the reservation system. In 1867, Fort Union was sold to the Army for a fraction of its original value. The soldiers renamed it Fort Buford and built it into a military post a few miles away, but the old trading fort was dismantled and its logs used for firewood. The commercial fortress that had once expanded American influence without a single cannon shot was gone, yet its legacy lingers in the historical record. The ledgers kept at Fort Union document prices, debts, and inventories that reveal the pulse of a vast economic network. The letters written by its traders describe the personalities and politics of the plains. And the fort itself has been reconstructed as a national historic site, where visitors can walk through the rebuilt walls and imagine the sound of the gate swinging open for another party of traders arriving with bundles of fur. Fort Union shows us that empire does not always march in uniform. Sometimes it arrives in a merchant's coat, carrying a ledger book and a stack of wool blankets. The frontier fortress built for profit rather than defense can be just as effective at extending a nation's reach as one built for war. And in that quiet, commercial expansion, we see how the boundaries of a country are often drawn not by generals, but by traders who know the value of a good relationship. At the meeting point of two great rivers, a different kind of fortress rose. The Mississippi and the Minnesota rivers converged near present-day St. Paul, and in 1819 the United States Army chose that exact spot to build a permanent military installation. They called it Fort Snelling, named after Colonel Josiah Snelling, the officer who oversaw its construction. The fort was not a wooden stockade thrown up in haste. It was a massive limestone structure with walls 5 feet thick at the base, a sturdy round tower called the Round Tower, and a hexagonal stone tower that served as a bastion. The walls enclosed a parade ground, barracks, officers' quarters, a hospital, a school, and a blacksmith shop. Everything was built to last because the Army intended Fort Snelling to be the anchor of American control over the entire upper Mississippi region. The location was strategic in the same way as Fort Dearborn and Fort Pitt had been. The rivers were the highways of the frontier, and whoever commanded the junction of two major waterways could control the flow of trade, travel, and military movement. From Fort Snelling, soldiers could patrol the Mississippi north into present-day Minnesota and Wisconsin, or west up the Minnesota River into the Dakota country. They could intercept British traders crossing the border from Canada, enforce American laws, and project authority over a territory that had only recently been acquired through treaties and purchases. The fort became the hub of a network of roads, trails, and supply depots that stretched across the northern plains. For the indigenous Dakota people who had lived along those rivers for generations, the arrival of Fort Snelling was a turning point. The fort sat on land that the Dakota had ceded in treaties, but the terms of those agreements were often misunderstood or enforced selectively. Soldiers and traders introduced new goods, new diseases, and new pressures on traditional hunting grounds. The fur trade shifted, and the buffalo herds that sustained the Plains nations began to shrink. The government also began a policy of concentrating Dakota bands onto reservations along the Minnesota River, hoping to clear the way for American settlers. The tension simmered for decades. In 1862, it boiled over in a conflict known as the Dakota War. The causes were many: broken treaty promises, delayed annuity payments, corrupt Indian agents, and a growing sense among Dakota warriors that their way of life was being erased. The fighting began when a group of young Dakota men attacked a settlement near the reservation. It quickly escalated into a series of raids and counter-raids across southwestern Minnesota. Hundreds of settlers lost their lives and thousands fled their homes. The United States government responded by mobilizing troops from Fort Snelling and other posts. The fort became the command center for the military campaign. Soldiers marched out from its gates to pursue Dakota war parties, and the wounded were brought back to its hospital. But Fort Snelling also served another, more somber role. After the conflict, the government captured hundreds of Dakota men, women, and children, and held them in a camp near the fort through the bitter winter. The conditions were harsh, and many did not survive. The fort became a site of confinement and displacement, a place where the consequences of expansion were concentrated in human terms. Historians note that this episode reshaped the relationship between the United States and the Plains nations, hardening attitudes and accelerating the push for removal to distant reservations. After the war, Fort Snelling remained a key military post. It served as a supply depot for campaigns against other native nations further west, and it became a base for the exploration and mapping of the northern plains and the Rocky Mountains. The Army used the fort to establish new posts like Fort Abercrombie and Fort Rice, extending the line of American control deeper into the Dakotas. In this way, Fort Snelling was not just a defensive stronghold but a springboard. The soldiers who drilled on its parade ground would later march hundreds of miles west, building roads and telegraph lines and laying the groundwork for the Transcontinental Railroad. The fort's role changed again in the 20th century. During World War I and World War II, the Army converted the old post into a training camp for new recruits. Thousands of soldiers passed through its gates before shipping out to Europe. The limestone walls that had once echoed with the commands of frontier soldiers now rang with the shouts of young men learning to fight in a modern war. After the conflicts ended, the fort was eventually decommissioned, and the land became a state park and a historic site. The old round tower still stands, overlooking the confluence of the Mississippi and the Minnesota rivers. Visitors can climb to the top and see the same view that soldiers and traders saw nearly 2 centuries ago. But the river below carries a different set of boats now, and the landscape around it has been transformed beyond recognition. Fort Snelling tells a complex story that weaves together military strategy, cultural encounter, conflict, displacement, and adaptation. It was a fortress built at a geographic crossroads, and like so many frontier forts, it became a crossroads of experience as well. The men and women who lived within its walls, whether soldiers, officers, laundresses, or prisoners, each carried away a different memory of the place. And the rivers that converge at its base continued to flow, carrying the currents of change that would eventually make the northern plains a settled part of a continental nation. At the far end of the Lewis and Clark journey, a tiny stockade held the weight of a continent. In December of 1805, the Corps of Discovery reached the Pacific Ocean and began searching for a place to spend the winter. They built a small enclosure of split logs, about 50 feet on each side, with a single gate and a few crude cabins inside its walls. They called it Fort Clatsop, named after the local Clatsop people who shared their food and knowledge during those wet, dark months. The fort was never designed to withstand an attack or to house a permanent garrison. It was a shelter, a workshop, and a base for hunting and exploring the nearby coastline. The men spent their days repairing equipment, making salt, trading with the Clatsop and Chinook communities, and writing in their journals. But for all its modesty, Fort Clatsop carried a quiet ambition. President Thomas Jefferson had instructed Meriwether Lewis and William Clark not only to cross the continent, but to assert an American presence in the Oregon country. The very act of building a structure, planting a flag, and recording the landscape was a claim. The fort was a physical statement that the United States had arrived at the Pacific and that its people intended to stay. The expedition left Fort Clatsop in March of 1806 and headed back east. The stockade was left to the rain and the rot. Within a few years, it collapsed into the forest floor, leaving hardly a trace. Yet the claim it represented did not vanish. American explorers, traders, and missionaries who came later pointed to the Lewis and Clark expedition as proof of national interest in the region. The Hudson's Bay Company built its own much larger and permanent Fort Vancouver a few years later on the Columbia River, but that fort was British. The temporary American fort, though gone, became a symbol of the rival claim. Decades later, when the boundary between British and American territory was finally settled, the memory of that tiny stockade helped strengthen the American position. Fort Clatsop was never a fortress in the traditional sense. It had no cannon, no moat, no thick stone walls. It was a winter camp, a rough shelter made of green logs and mud. But as a placeholder, it worked. It marked the farthest point of an expedition that transformed a vague national aspiration into a tangible footprint. Today, a reconstruction of Fort Clatsop stands near the original site in Oregon, and visitors can walk through its gate and see the cramped rooms where the Corps of Discovery spent one of the most consequential winters in American history. The fort teaches us that sometimes the most powerful fortresses are not the ones built to last. They are the ones built to say, "We were here," and that claim, left behind in the mud and the moss, can outlive the walls themselves. Months before they reached the Pacific, the Corps of Discovery built another winter fort that served a very different purpose. In the fall of 1804, Lewis and Clark halted their journey near the heart of what is now North Dakota. They chose a spot on the Missouri River within sight of several large Mandan earth lodge villages, and there they constructed a sturdy stockade they called Fort Mandan. The fort was not large, perhaps 50 feet on each side, with a palisade of cottonwood logs and a row of huts lining the interior. But its real walls were built not of wood, but of relationships. The Mandan people had long been known as skilled farmers and traders, living in permanent towns where they grew corn, beans, and squash, and conducted a lively exchange with nomadic hunting nations from the plains. Lewis and Clark understood that their expedition could not survive the harsh Dakota winter without the goodwill of these communities, and more importantly, that the success of President Jefferson's vision for American expansion depended on forging peaceful connections with the peoples who controlled the interior. So Fort Mandan became something unusual on the frontier, a collaborative fortress. The captains invited Mandan and Hidatsa leaders into the fort for councils where they exchanged gifts, smoked the pipe, and made speeches about friendship and trade. The Americans promised access to manufactured goods and military protection in exchange for safe passage and information about the rivers and tribes ahead. The Mandan, in turn, shared food, shelter, and knowledge of the land. They taught the explorers how to make warm clothing from buffalo hides and how to preserve meat in the bitter cold. They also introduced them to a French-Canadian trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau, who lived among the Hidatsa, and to his young Shoshone wife, Sacagawea. Her presence with the expedition later proved invaluable, not as a guide in the popular sense, but as a symbol of peace and as an interpreter whose language skills opened doors with tribes along the upper Missouri. The winter at Fort Mandan was a season of diplomacy. The fort became a meeting ground where different worlds exchanged knowledge. The Americans recorded detailed notes about Mandan culture, language, and agriculture, information that would later shape government policy and guide future settlers. The Mandan and Hidatsa gained access to metal tools, firearms, and new trade networks that strengthened their position against rival nations. This mutual benefit, however, was not entirely balanced. The very act of building a fortified post on the Missouri River was a claim, a quiet assertion that the United States had a permanent interest in this land. The friendships forged at Fort Mandan made the expedition possible, but they also laid the groundwork for a wave of American influence that would eventually transform the region. The fort itself was dismantled in the spring when the Corps of Discovery continued west, but the relationships did not vanish. The narratives, maps, and reports that Lewis and Clark carried back with them included detailed descriptions of the Mandan villages and their strategic location. That information later guided traders, missionaries, and military planners. Fort Mandan shows us that a fortress does not need to bristle with cannon to project power. Sometimes the most effective frontier stronghold is the one that opens doors instead of closing them. The conversations held inside its walls shaped the course of an expanding nation, and the memory of that winter of collaboration reminds us that expansion is never a one-way street. It is built on encounter, negotiation, and the fragile trust of people who choose to share a fire. Not every frontier fortress was built by a government. Fort Boonesborough was a private venture, a gamble on land, profit, and the future of a continent. In the spring of 1775, a small party of woodsmen led by Daniel Boone hacked a trail through the Cumberland Gap and marked a route into the heart of what would become Kentucky. At the end of that path, on the south bank of the Kentucky River, they raised a stockade of upright logs. Inside, cabins lined the walls, and a blockhouse at each corner provided a place to fire from cover. The gate was heavy and barred at night. The whole enclosure was maybe 200 feet long and 150 wide. It was not an army post. It was a company town built by the Transylvania Company, a group of wealthy land speculators who had purchased a huge tract from the Cherokee in a treaty that the Cherokee leadership later disputed. The company sold shares to settlers, promising rich soil and safe shelter. In exchange, those settlers agreed to work the land, defend the fort, and help the company profit from the rising value of real estate in the Ohio Valley. Fort Boonesborough was a fortress of private ambition. It protected families and their livestock from the raids that often came from Shawnee and other native nations, who saw this flood of newcomers as a direct threat to their hunting grounds and their way of life. The men who stood watch on the walls were not soldiers paid by a distant capital. They were farmers and hunters who had staked everything on a plot of ground they hoped to call their own. This was a different kind of frontier expansion, driven not by imperial orders but by individual hunger for land. The fort became a hub. Wagon roads converged on it. Surveyors used it as a base for measuring out claims. Traders brought salt, ammunition, and iron goods. The population grew, and new stations, smaller fortified settlements with names like Boiling Spring and Harrodsburg, spread outward like ripples. Each one was a claim, a piece of territory that the United States would eventually incorporate into its national domain. But the expansion came at a cost that historians are still reckoning with. The land that the Transylvania Company sold had been used for generations by the Shawnee, the Cherokee, and other nations. The treaties that transferred it were signed under pressure, sometimes by leaders who did not represent the full community. The arrival of settlers brought hardship to the people who had lived there long before. Hunting grounds shrank, disputes over boundaries turned violent. The promise of peace that the fort represented for one group meant the destruction of a way of life for another. Fort Boonesborough thus stands as a complex symbol. It was a shelter for some and a wedge for others. It multiplied the reach of private capital, transforming a remote wilderness into a patchwork of farms and fences. And it showed how a privately built fortress could accelerate the expansion of the frontier far faster than any slow-moving government program. The fort itself did not last long. By the early 1800s, Kentucky was so thickly settled that the old stockade was no longer needed. The logs rotted, the land was plowed, and the site became just another field along the river. Yet the pattern it set, of private enterprise pushing the boundary of settlement ahead of official authority, repeated itself across the American West. Fort Boonesborough was a seed, and what grew from it would reshape an entire continent. One stone fortress at the mouth of the Niagara River held the key to an entire continent. Fort Niagara commanded the narrow strait where Lake Ontario drains into the Niagara River, a natural funnel through which all traffic between the upper and lower Great Lakes had to pass. Any ship, any canoe, any army moving between the heart of the continent and the Atlantic seaboard had to navigate this bottleneck. The fort sat on a high bluff overlooking the river, its cannon trained on the water, its walls angled to repel assault from any direction. The French built it in 1726, calling it Fort Niagara, and they made sure it was strong. The main structure was a massive stone building called the French Castle, a 4-story edifice with walls several feet thick, loopholes for muskets, and a roof designed to catch rainwater for the garrison. Surrounding it were earthworks, a ditch, and outer batteries. It was a fortress built to last, and it did. For the French, Fort Niagara was the linchpin of their North American empire. It connected their settlements along the St. Lawrence River to the vast interior of the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes. From this base, French soldiers and their allied indigenous forces could control the movement of furs, supplies, and military reinforcements. They could also block British expansion from the east, because any English trader or soldier trying to reach the upper lakes had to pass within sight of the fort's watchtowers. The French held it for 33 years, and during that time it became a symbol of their dominance over the region. But the French and Indian War changed everything. In 1759, a British army under General Sir William Johnson laid siege to Fort Niagara. The French garrison, cut off from relief, held out for 19 days. When the fort finally surrendered, the British marched in and raised their flag over the French castle. The fall of Fort Niagara was a turning point in the war. It severed the French supply line to the Ohio country and opened the door for British control of the Great Lakes. The British immediately recognized the fort's value. They repaired the damage, strengthened the defenses, and stationed a permanent garrison there. Fort Niagara became the western headquarters of the British Army in North America. From its gates, they launched campaigns to secure the newly conquered territories and to enforce treaties that pushed native nations out of their traditional lands. For the next 3 decades, the fort was a center of British power, a place where officials distributed gifts to allied tribes, where traders obtained licenses, and where the boundaries of empire were enforced. Then came the American Revolution. After the war, the Treaty of Paris in 1783 awarded the region to the newly independent United States. But the British did not leave. They argued that the treaty's terms were unclear, and they continued to occupy Fort Niagara for another 13 years, using it as a base to support native resistance against American expansion. It was only in 1796, under the terms of Jay's Treaty, that the British finally handed the keys over to the United States. the American flag rose over the French castle, and the fort took on yet another identity. For the young republic, Fort Niagara was a prize that secured the Great Lakes frontier. It protected American settlements in western New York and guaranteed access to the upper lakes for trade and military movement. During the War of 1812, the fort was a staging ground for American campaigns into Canada, and it withstood bombardment from British artillery across the river. The walls that had been built by the French, strengthened by the British, and held by the Americans absorbed the shock of war and survived. After the war, the fort gradually lost its military importance. The frontier moved west and newer forts replaced it. By the late 19th century, Fort Niagara was a quiet outpost used mainly for recruiting and storage. In 1963, it was turned over to the state of New York and preserved as a historic site. Today, visitors can walk through the French castle, peer out the same windows where French soldiers once scanned the lake for British sails, and stand on the earthworks that British gunners defended against American assault. The fort's story is one of continuity and change. Each empire that held it left its mark, adding new buildings, modifying the defenses, and adapting the fort to the needs of a different era. But the strategic reality never changed. Whoever controlled the mouth of the Niagara River controlled the flow of people and goods between the Great Lakes. That geographic truth outlasted the imperial ambitions of France, Britain, and the United States. Fort Niagara stands as a reminder that a single choke point, when fortified and held, can decide the fate of a region for centuries. And the quiet stone walls on that bluff still hold the echoes of the soldiers and traders who passed through its gate, each one carrying a dream of empire that would eventually fade into the soil of a new nation. On the strait connecting Lake Huron and Lake Erie, another fortress shaped the heart of a continent. Fort Detroit was not as old as Fort Niagara, but its position was just as vital. The French built it in 1701, planting a settlement on the narrow waterway that linked the upper Great Lakes to the lower ones. The spot was a natural crossroads. Canoes and baytalks coming down from Lake Huron had to pass this point to reach Lake Erie and the St. Lawrence, and the land around it, a long, narrow peninsula, offered rich soil and easy access to the interior. The French commander, Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac, saw this place as more than a military post. He envisioned a permanent colony, a center for trade that could anchor French influence in the heart of North America. So Fort Detroit became a village as much as a fortress. Inside its palisade of upright logs, French settlers built houses, a church, a blacksmith shop, and a warehouse. Outside, farms spread along the riverbanks. The French encouraged native nations, especially the Huron, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi, to settle nearby, offering protection and access to trade goods. The fort became a meeting ground where diplomacy and commerce mixed freely. Every spring, traders from Montreal arrived with kegs of powder, bolts of cloth, and iron tools. They exchanged these for beaver pelts and other furs that had been collected by hunters and trappers throughout the winter. Fort Detroit was the clearinghouse for a vast network that stretched from the Ohio Valley to the upper Mississippi. The French held this key position for more than half a century. During the French and Indian War, the fort served as a supply base for campaigns to the south and west. But as the war turned against France, the fort's isolation became a vulnerability. In 1760, after the fall of Montreal, the French commandant at Detroit received word that the war was over. He surrendered the fort to a British force without a fight. The British marched in, raised their flag, and began to reorganize the trade and alliances that had sustained the fort for decades. The change was immediate. British officials were less willing to distribute gifts and maintain the careful diplomacy that the French had practiced. They imposed stricter trade regulations and treated the surrounding native nations as conquered subjects rather than allies. The resentment simmered. Just 3 years later, in the spring of 1763, that resentment exploded into a coordinated uprising that became known as Pontiac's War. The Ottawa leader Pontiac gathered a coalition of warriors from several nations and laid siege to Fort Detroit. The fort was an obvious target. It was the symbol of British authority in the region, and its fall would send a powerful signal. Pontiac's forces surrounded the stockade, cutting off supply lines and trapping the garrison inside. For months, the British soldiers and the families who had taken refuge within the walls endured a grueling test of endurance. Cannon fire from the fort kept the attackers at bay, but the defenders could not break the siege. They waited for reinforcements that were slow to arrive. Pontiac's warriors tried several times to storm the walls, but the fort's defenses held. The siege dragged on through the summer and into the fall. Meanwhile, other forts in the region fell to similar uprisings. The British were shocked by the scale and ferocity of the resistance. Fort Detroit, however, never surrendered. In the end, Pontiac's coalition began to fray. Some nations made separate peace agreements with the British, and the arrival of fresh troops forced Pontiac to lift the siege in late October. The fort survived, but the experience changed British policy. The Crown realized that it could not simply dictate terms to the nations of the Great Lakes region. New agreements were negotiated, and the practice of gift-giving was restored. The siege of Fort Detroit proved that a frontier fortress could become a focal point for resistance as much as for control. The walls that the French had built to protect trade became a target for those who refused to accept a new master. And the fort itself, battered but standing, became a symbol of a fragile peace that would shape the future of the continent. The coquina walls of Castillo de San Marcos absorbed cannonballs like a sponge. This ancient stone fortress in St. Augustine, Florida, was built not of granite or brick but of a soft, porous limestone made from millions of tiny seashell fragments compressed over thousands of years. When British warships bombarded its walls during the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the coquina did not shatter. Instead, it compressed, the cannonballs sinking into the stone like teeth into soft bread, leaving the structure intact while the attackers wasted their ammunition. That simple material property turned Castillo de San Marcos into one of the most resilient fortresses in North America, and it gave Spain a foothold in a region constantly threatened by English expansion. The fortress was the northern anchor of a defensive line that protected the Spanish treasure fleet route, the annual convoy of ships loaded with silver and gold from Mexico and South America that sailed through the Florida Straits on its way to Spain. If that route fell into enemy hands, the entire Spanish Empire in the Americas would be crippled. St. Augustine was the closest Spanish settlement to the treasure ships, and Castillo de San Marcos was the key to holding that coast. Construction began in 1672, after a British raid had burned the earlier wooden fort to the ground. The Spanish crown poured resources into the new structure, building a massive masonry bastion with 4 diamond-shaped corners that allowed defenders to fire on attackers from multiple angles. The walls were nearly 20 feet thick at the base, tapering to just over 10 feet at the top. Inside, the fort contained barracks, a chapel, a hospital, and storerooms for food and ammunition. But the real genius was the coquina. Quarried from Anastasia Island just across the bay, the stone was soft enough to be cut with simple tools, yet remarkably resistant to cannon fire. When a British fleet under Governor James Moore of Carolina attacked in 1702, their cannonballs sank into the walls without causing collapse. The Spanish garrison returned fire and held out until British supplies ran low, forcing the attackers to withdraw. A second major British assault in 1740, led by General James Oglethorpe, met the same fate. Oglethorpe bombarded the fort for nearly a month, but the coquina absorbed the punishment. When a Spanish relief fleet arrived from Havana, Oglethorpe abandoned the siege and sailed away. The fort never fell to direct attack. That resilience allowed Spain to maintain a permanent presence in Florida for more than 2 centuries, even as British colonies grew and American independence reshaped the continent. The fort also served as a base for Spanish allies among the local native communities, who used it as a refuge during conflicts. The design of Castillo de San Marcos was not just about withstanding assault. It was about outlasting the enemy will to fight. The planners knew that a fortress on the edge of an empire could not rely on constant reinforcements. Ships from Havana took weeks to arrive, and soldiers were expensive to maintain. So they built a fortress that could survive on its own, with cisterns that stored rainwater and thick walls that kept the interior cool even under a Florida sun. The garrison could wait inside while attackers ran low on food, water, and patience. That strategy turned the fort into a delaying tool, buying time for diplomatic negotiations or relief expeditions. In 1763, at the end of the 7 Years' War, Spain traded Florida to Britain in exchange for Havana. The fort passed to British control peacefully, but the British did not change much. They recognized the value of the coquina walls and kept the fort in service. When Spain regained Florida 20 years later, the fort went back to Spanish hands. It would later serve as a prison during the American Revolution and as a military post under the United States. Each era left its mark, but the walls remained unchanged. The coquina that had softened cannonballs in the 1700s still stood firm in the 1900s. Today, Castillo de San Marcos is a national monument, and visitors can walk along its ramparts and look out over the Atlantic, imagining the sails of British warships on the horizon. The fort teaches us that the most durable frontier fortresses are not always the ones with the thickest stone. Sometimes they are the ones built with the right kind of stone, a material that gives way just enough to survive. And in that survival, an empire gains something more valuable than a victory in battle. It gains time, and time on a contested frontier can be the difference between holding a foothold and losing a continent. On a cluster of rocky islands outside Helsinki, a sea fortress rose from the waves. The Swedes called it Sveaborg, but today the world knows it as Suomenlinna, a name that echoes through Finnish history. Construction began in 1748, after Sweden had lost a war to Russia and seen its eastern frontier shrink dangerously close to the Finnish coast. The fortress was designed to be an impregnable shield, a naval base that could block a Russian fleet from entering the Gulf of Finland and threatening the capital, Stockholm. It was built over decades, a massive project that swallowed enormous amounts of timber, stone, and labor. Soldiers and convicts worked alongside hired craftsmen, digging canals, raising ramparts, and mounting hundreds of cannon on the gray granite walls. The fortress grew into a small town with barracks, a church, a dry dock, and a bakery that could produce thousands of loaves of bread a day. It was a statement of Swedish determination. We will hold this frontier no matter the cost. And the cost was immense. The Swedish treasury poured funds into Suomenlinna, gold that could have been used for other projects. The fortress drained resources from the rest of the kingdom, creating a growing burden that weighed on the economy. Yet for a time, the investment seemed justified. The fortress projected Swedish power deep into Finland, securing the coast and allowing Swedish officials to control trade and military movement across the region. Finnish communities near the fortress prospered from the construction and the garrison. The islands became a center of commerce and culture, a bridge between Sweden and its eastern province. But the fortress had a hidden weakness. It was designed to resist a naval assault, not a siege from land, and the empire that built it was slowly weakening. By the early 1800s, Sweden's political influence in Europe had declined, and its military resources were stretched thin. When Russia launched a renewed campaign against Finland in 1808, the fortress of Suomenlinna faced a test it was never meant to endure. The Russian army advanced overland, cutting off the fortress from reinforcements and supplies. The Swedish garrison, numbering nearly 7,000 men, found itself surrounded. The Russian commander offered generous terms, and after a winter of hardship and dwindling provisions, the fortress surrendered without a major battle. The cannons that had cost so much to cast and mount were turned over to the enemy. The Russians marched in and raised their flag over the bastions. Sweden had lost not just a fortress, but its entire hold on Finland. The fall of Suomenlinna showed that even the most carefully engineered stronghold is only as strong as the nation that stands behind it. When the empire faltered, the fortress could not hold. The great sea fortress that had been built to defend against Russia became a Russian base instead. For Finland, the transition was difficult, but in time the fortress took on a new meaning. After Finland gained independence, the name was changed to Suomenlinna, the Castle of Finland, and it became a symbol of national identity rather than imperial ambition. Today visitors walk along its grassy ramparts and peer into the casemates where soldiers once slept. They see the dry dock where warships were built and the church that still holds services. The stone walls that were supposed to keep Russia out now stand as a quiet reminder that no fortress can outlast the empire that builds it. The fortress itself endures, but the power that raised it has long since faded into the cold northern sea. In the warm waters of the Adriatic, a different kind of fortress used the mountains themselves as walls. The Bay of Kotor is not a simple harbor. It is a deep, winding fjord that cuts into the rugged coastline of what is now Montenegro, a series of narrow channels and sheltered basins surrounded by steep limestone peaks. For centuries, this natural inlet was the only safe harbor for hundreds of miles of rocky shore, a vital stop for ships carrying goods between the Mediterranean and the interior of the Balkans. The Venetian Republic recognized its value early. In the 14th century, Venice took control of the town of Kotor at the innermost end of the bay, and over the next 300 years they turned the surrounding heights into an interconnected network of fortifications. The fortifications were not a single castle. They were a layered system of walls, towers, bastions, and citadels that climbed the slopes above the town, rising step by step up the mountain face. The highest point was the fortress of St. John, perched more than 800 feet above the water. From that elevation, lookouts could spot a ship entering the bay a full day before it reached the town. Signal fires or cannon shots could relay warnings down the chain of defenses, giving the garrison time to prepare. The natural topography was the fortress. The cliffs themselves became vertical walls that no enemy could scale, and the narrow channels restricted approach to a few predictable routes. Any fleet attempting to attack Kotor had to sail through a gauntlet. Cannons mounted on the slopes could fire down onto the decks of ships from above, while batteries at water level could rake them from the side. The approach was so dangerous that many commanders simply chose not to try. This defensive depth served a purpose far beyond protecting a single town. The Bay of Kotor was the southern anchor of Venice's maritime frontier in the Adriatic. From this base, Venetian galleys could patrol the sea lanes connecting the Italian peninsula to the eastern shores, intercepting pirates and monitoring the movement of Ottoman ships. The Republic of Venice was a maritime empire, its wealth built on trade routes that stretched from Constantinople to London. To protect that trade, Venice needed secure harbors where ships could resupply, repair, and take shelter. Kotor provided that shelter, and the fortifications ensured that no hostile power could use the bay as a staging ground against Venetian interests. The fortifications also allowed Venice to project influence into the Balkan hinterland. From Kotor, Venetian agents and merchants traveled inland along established trade routes, exchanging salt, wine, and glass for wool, hides, and silver. The fortress was a gateway, not a barrier. It controlled the flow of goods and people, The Ottoman Empire, which expanded across the Balkans during the 15th and 16th centuries, repeatedly threatened this gateway. Ottoman armies pushed toward the coast, and several times they laid siege to Kotor, but the combination of sheer cliffs, layered defenses, and the ability to resupply by sea made the fortress nearly impossible to take. The Ottomans never succeeded in capturing Kotor by force. The garrison could hold out for months, waiting for reinforcements to arrive from Venice or for the besieging army to run low on supplies and withdraw. In this way, the fortress became a symbol of Venetian resilience, a finger of influence thrust into a region that was otherwise under Ottoman control. The natural defensive topography was not just an aid, it was an extension of the fortress concept itself. The Venetians did not try to reshape the mountain. They adapted to it, building walls that followed the contours of the rock, carving staircases into the stone, and positioning batteries so that every approach was covered. The result was a fortress that seemed to grow out of the landscape, as if the mountain itself had decided to guard the bay. Today, the old fortifications are a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and visitors can hike the winding path up to the fortress of St. John. From the top, the view stretches across the entire bay, a panorama of blue water and green slopes. The cannons are gone, but the walls remain, silent witnesses to a time when a single fortified harbor could anchor the ambitions of a maritime republic. And in that silent stone, we see how a fortress can be more than a structure of human hands. It can be a partnership between human purpose and the natural world, a collaboration that made the frontier not a line on a map, but a living, breathing shield of rock and sea. The stone walls of Valletta rise straight from the Mediterranean, a city carved from golden limestone and fortified with a level of ambition that seemed almost absurd for an island only 17 miles long. The Knights Hospitaller, a religious military order that had been driven from Rhodes by the Ottomans, settled on Malta in 1530. They knew that if they were to survive, they needed to turn this barren rock into an impenetrable fortress. Over the next 2 centuries, they built not just a city but an interconnected system of bastions, ramparts, and ditches that wrapped around the entire peninsula of Valletta and stretched across the harbors of the Grand Harbor and Marsamxit. The fortress of St. Elmo guarded the entrance to both harbors, a star-shaped stronghold that sat on a low promontory and could rake any approaching ship with cannon fire. Further inland, the Santa Margherita lines and the Kotor lines created a second and third layer of defense, rings of stone that could trap an attacker between them. The entire system was a masterpiece of military engineering, designed by some of the finest architects of the Renaissance, including Francesco Laparelli and Girolamo Cassar. They understood that Malta was not just an island. It was a stepping stone, a base from which Christian navies could project power into the central Mediterranean and threaten Ottoman trade routes between North Africa and Constantinople. The Ottoman Empire saw it the same way. In 1565, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent sent a massive invasion fleet with tens of thousands of soldiers to wipe the Knights off the map. The siege began in May and lasted nearly 4 months. The Knights, with help from the Maltese population, retreated from the outer forts and concentrated their defense in the fortified towns of Birgu and Singlia. The fighting was intense, and the defenders endured long periods without supplies, but the fortifications held. The walls absorbed the Ottoman bombardment, and the Knights counterattacked with sorties that kept the enemy off balance. In September, a relief force arrived from Sicily, and the Ottoman army withdrew in defeat. The Great Siege of Malta became a legendary event in European history, a moment when a tiny island fortress had turned back the tide of an empire. After the siege, the Knights rebuilt and expanded. They founded the new city of Valletta, named after their Grand Master Jean de Valette, and surrounded it with the most advanced fortifications of the age. The city itself became a fortress with gates that could be sealed, underground passages for soldiers, and a massive ditch that isolated the peninsula from the main island. The knights also built an elaborate system of aqueducts to bring fresh water and underground silos to store grain for years of siege. They were preparing for the next Ottoman attack, which never came. But the fortifications served a purpose beyond defense. They turned Malta into a base for Christian privateers and naval squadrons that harassed Ottoman shipping across the Mediterranean. From the safety of Valletta's harbors, galleys could sortie out, strike at enemy ports, and return to repair and resupply behind walls that no force could breach. The island became a strategic outpost that amplified the power of the Spanish Empire and the papacy, giving them a forward position deep in Ottoman waters. The knights survived for over 2 centuries on Malta because they understood that a fortress is not just about holding ground. It is about projecting influence. Valletta's walls did not simply protect a city. They protected an idea that a small, determined group could stand against a much larger power by using stone, geometry, and sheer will. Today, the fortifications are an UNESCO World Heritage Site, and visitors can walk along the bastions and look out over the same harbors where Ottoman galleys once gathered. The cannons are silent, but the walls still hold the memory of that summer when an island fortress changed the course of the Mediterranean. The limestone walls of Valletta guarded the western Mediterranean, but on the opposite end of the same ocean, a different fortress anchored a far older trade network. Diu Fort sits on a small island off the coast of Gujarat in western India, a low, rocky scrap of land that barely rises above the Arabian Sea. The Portuguese built it in 1535, not long after they had first sailed around Africa and into the Indian Ocean. They chose the spot with ruthless precision. Diu was not a major port on its own, but it sat near the mouth of the Gulf of Combat, a funnel that channeled ships carrying spices, textiles, and precious stones from the interior of India toward the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. Any vessel heading to the great markets of Gujarat or further north had to pass within sight of Diu. The Portuguese saw that and built a fortress that could reach out and touch those ships. The fort itself is a compact structure of dark basalt and laterite stone, with thick walls that curve and angle to deflect cannon fire. A massive bastion called the Cavallero juts out toward the sea, its guns commanding the approaches from every direction. Inside, a chapel, a governor's residence, and barracks cluster around a central courtyard. But the real weapon of Diu Fort was not its stonework. It was the system of permits and passes that the Portuguese enforced from its gates. Every ship that wanted to trade in the region had to buy a cart as a document that granted safe passage in exchange for a fee. Without one, the fortress cannons would open fire. With one, the ship could proceed, but only after paying duties on its cargo and often after unloading part of its goods for inspection at Diu. This system turned the fortress into a floating customs house, a choke point that skimmed wealth from every voyage that crossed the Arabian Sea. The spice trade that flowed through this region was the lifeblood of the global economy in the 16th century. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg moved from the Maluku Islands and the Malabar coast to ports like Calicut and Surat, then onward to the markets of Cairo, Venice, and Lisbon. By controlling Diu, the Portuguese inserted themselves into that flow at a critical junction. They did not need to conquer the entire coast. They only needed one well-placed fortress, a handful of warships, and the willingness to enforce their monopoly with overwhelming force. The result was a transformation of the global spice trade. European merchants who had once relied on overland routes through the Middle East now found themselves dependent on Portuguese permits and Portuguese ports. Diu became a hub where Indian merchants, Arab traders, and European factors met to negotiate prices, exchange goods, and settle disputes under the shadow of the fortress walls. But the Portuguese presence was never absolute. Local rulers, especially the Sultan of Gujarat, resisted the fort's control. In 1538, just 3 years after construction began, a combined force of Gujarati and Ottoman troops laid siege to Diu. The Portuguese garrison, outnumbered and low on supplies, held out for months. The siege became a legendary test of endurance, with the defenders resorting to eating cats and rats before a relief fleet arrived from Goa. The fortress survived and its legend grew. For the next 2 centuries, Diu remained a Portuguese stronghold, a symbol of European naval dominance in a region where no single power had ever held such sway. The fortress also served as a base for missionary activity and cultural exchange. Portuguese priests built churches in the nearby town, and the local population absorbed elements of European architecture, language, and religion. The island of Diu became a curious blend of Indian and Portuguese worlds, a place where the stone walls of a fortress became the foundation for a new kind of coastal society. By the 20th century, the fort's military importance had faded, but its legacy endured. When India gained independence, Diu remained under Portuguese control until 1961, when it was finally integrated into the Indian Union. Today, the fortress stands as a museum, its ramparts offering a view of the same sea lanes that once carried the wealth of the East. Visitors walk through the old gate and see the cannon still aimed at the horizon, silent now, but still telling the story of how a single fortress on a small island could reach across an ocean and reshape the way the world traded. On the northern edge of Japan, a star-shaped fortress rose from the marshy plains of Hokkaido, a direct response to a different kind of imperial pressure. The Tokugawa shogunate had long considered Hokkaido a distant, loosely controlled frontier, home to the indigenous Ainu people and valued mainly for its fishing and fur trade. But by the mid-19th century, Russian ships began appearing off the coast, surveying harbors and making contact with local communities. The threat was real. Russia had already expanded across Siberia to the Pacific, and it seemed only a matter of time before it would push south toward Japan's northern islands. The shogunate responded by fortifying the region, and the most ambitious project was Goryokaku, a massive star-shaped fortress built in the 1850s at the port of Hakodate. The design was not Japanese. It was copied directly from European military manuals, specifically the Trace Italian style that had proven so effective against cannon fire in Europe and the Americas. 5-pointed bastions, low-angled walls, and a dry moat surrounded by earthworks, all arranged so that every approach was covered by overlapping fields of fire. The fortress was a clear statement. Japan was learning from the West to defend itself against the West, but Goryokaku was never used for that purpose. Before the fortress was even fully completed, the Tokugawa shogunate collapsed in the Meiji Restoration of 1868. The new imperial government, determined to centralize power and modernize the country, faced a rebellion from loyalist shogunate forces who retreated to Hokkaido and took refuge inside Goryokaku. In the winter of 1868–69, the fortress became the last stronghold of the old regime. The rebel forces, calling themselves the Republic of Ezo, held out for months, but the new imperial army surrounded the star-shaped walls and bombarded them with modern artillery. In the end, the fortress surrendered and the Meiji government took control. What happened next transformed Hokkaido. The new government saw the island not just as a frontier, but as a blank slate for colonization and development. They adopted the same European techniques they had studied at Goryokaku and applied them to the entire region. They sent settlers, built roads, established farms, and imposed Japanese language and customs on the Ainu population. The fortress itself became a symbol of this new direction, a monument to Japan's determination to secure its northern border and expand its territory. Goryokaku was never a fortress that fought against Russia, but its very existence and the story of its construction and surrender reveals how Japan used European military architecture to consolidate its own empire. The star-shaped walls that were meant to keep out one empire became the stage for the birth of another. And today, when visitors walk through the restored grounds and climb the observation tower, they see not just a five-pointed fort, but a turning point in the history of a nation that learned to build walls in order to break through its own limits. Deep in the forests of the Taunus mountain range, a Roman fort has been rebuilt so faithfully that it feels frozen in time. Solberg is not a ruin. It is a full-scale reconstruction completed in the early 1900s that brings the reality of the Roman frontier back into view. Its stone walls, its gateways, its barracks and granaries all stand as they might have appeared to a soldier stationed there in the 2nd century. But Solberg was never just a military outpost. It was a base for controlling the surrounding region and monitoring the communities beyond the border. From its watchtowers, Roman soldiers could scan the wooded hills for signs of movement, and they could send patrols along the fortified line known as the limes that stretched for hundreds of miles from the Rhine to the Danube. That line was not a simple wall. It was a carefully surveyed boundary that marked the edge of Roman authority. Behind it, roads, villages, and farms spread across the landscape. Ahead of it lay the territories of Germanic peoples who were neither fully conquered nor fully independent. The Roman strategy was subtle. They did not try to push the limes further into the forest indefinitely. Instead, they used forts like Solberg to create a buffer zone where trade and contact could flourish. Germanic leaders were invited to the fort for negotiations and gifts. Roman merchants set up shops near the garrison, and the local population gradually adopted Roman goods, Roman clothing, and Roman customs. The fort became a center of Romanization. A farmer living a few miles beyond the limes might never see a Roman legionary in his village, but he would handle Roman pottery, use Roman tools, and hear stories about the comforts of the bathhouse inside the walls of Solberg. The economic pull of the empire was stronger than its military reach. By maintaining a permanent presence on the frontier, Rome did not just defend against threats. It created a zone of influence where its culture could penetrate deeper than any sword ever could. The Solberg was a door, not a barrier, and that door swung both ways, letting Roman ideas flow outward and drawing the frontier communities into a broader system of exchange that reshaped the entire region for centuries. The stones of the Pharaoh's lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, were not lost to time. They were repurposed. In 1477, the Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Katebey ordered a fortress built on the very spot where that legendary lighthouse had once guided ships into the harbor of Alexandria. The new citadel rose from the rubble of the old wonder, its walls incorporating the same limestone blocks that had once held a beacon visible for miles across the Mediterranean. The symbolism was unmistakable. A new power was rising on the foundations of an older one, but the Mamluk Sultanate was already showing signs of strain. Its military had once been the most feared in the region, a slave soldier dynasty that had defeated the Mongols and the Crusaders. By the late 15th century, however, the old certainties were crumbling. New threats emerged from both the east and the west. The Ottoman Empire was expanding across Anatolia and into the Arab world, while European navies, particularly those of Portugal and Spain, were probing the coasts of North Africa and the Levant. Katebey Citadel was built to address both dangers. Its thick walls and massive round towers commanded the entrance to Alexandria's eastern harbor, a natural port that had been a gateway to Egypt for millennia. From its ramparts, gunners could fire on any ship trying to approach the city. The fortress also housed a garrison that could respond to raids and enforce Mamluk authority along the coast. For a few decades, the citadel performed its function well. It protected Alexandria from a direct assault, and the Mamluks used it as a base to project naval power into the eastern Mediterranean. But the fortress could not stop the larger shift in the balance of power. In 1516, the Ottoman Sultan Selim I crushed the Mamluk army at the Battle of Majd-Dabik, and within a year the Mamluk Sultanate had ceased to exist. The citadel passed into Ottoman hands without a fight. The new rulers maintained it, recognizing its strategic value, but the fortress never again served as the seat of an independent Mamluk dynasty. It became a provincial outpost, a reminder of a once great empire that had been unable to fortify itself against the tides of history. The story of Kate Bay Citadel is a lesson in how fortresses can postpone the end but cannot prevent it. They buy time, but they do not change the underlying forces that drive empires toward collapse. The Mamluks had built a stronghold of stone, but they had not been able to build the alliances, the economies, or the military reforms needed to survive the rise of a more dynamic neighbor. The citadel still stands today, a solid ring of masonry on the edge of the sea, and visitors can walk its battlements and look out over the same waters that once carried Ottoman warships. The stones that once held the light of the pharaohs now hold only the weight of memory, and in that quiet weight, we see how even the most impressive fortress can become a monument not to strength, but to the fragility of the power that built it. The cinnamon that drifted through the air of Galle Fort was more valuable than gold. When the Dutch East India Company seized this stone fortress on the southwestern coast of Sri Lanka in 1640, they did not think of it as a military outpost. They saw it as a corporate headquarters, a fortified warehouse, and a customs checkpoint all rolled into one. The island of Ceylon, as it was then called, was the world's primary source of cinnamon, a spice so precious that it could buy armies and influence the politics of entire kingdoms. Cinnamon grew wild in the interior forests, harvested by trained peelers who knew the secret of stripping the bark from the tender shoots. The Dutch did not need to conquer every village. They only needed to control the ports where that cinnamon was loaded onto ships, and Galle was the finest harbor on the coast. The fort itself was a compact walled city, not a narrow barracks. Inside its ramparts, the Dutch built a grid of streets lined with whitewashed houses, a church with a high-pitched roof, a bell tower that chimed the hours, and a sprawling warehouse complex where cinnamon was sorted, weighed, and packed into chests. The governor lived in a stately residence with a garden and a view of the sea. The garrison drilled on a parade ground, but the real business of the fort was conducted in the counting houses and the auction hall. The Dutch East India Company operated like a sovereign power, issuing its own coinage, negotiating treaties with local kings, and enforcing a monopoly on the spice trade. Any ship that tried to export cinnamon without a company permit risked seizure and its crew imprisoned in the fort's dungeons. The fort's architecture reflected this dual identity. The bastions were named after trade goods: clove, cinnamon, pepper, and sun. The walls were thick enough to withstand a siege, but the gates were wide enough for a bullock cart loaded with spice chests to pass through. The Dutch did not build Galle to fight wars. They built it to administer a monopoly. The fort became the hub of a regional network that reached inland to the cinnamon groves and outward to the ports of Java, India, and Europe. For nearly 2 centuries, the Dutch East India Company used this fortress as a lever to pry open the global spice market, transforming a small harbor town into a node of an empire that stretched half a world away. When the British took control in 1796, they changed the flag but kept the fort. The walls that had once stored cinnamon later held tea, rubber, and coconut oil. The fort outlived the Dutch Empire, outlasted the British Empire, and today stands as a living museum, its cobbled streets still lined with the merchants' houses and the old church. But the story it tells is not one of kings and generals. It is the story of a corporation that built a fortress to control a flavor, and in doing so, reshaped the commerce of an entire ocean. On the Malabar coast, a single stone fort gave Europe its first foothold in India. The fortress of St. George, built by the Portuguese in the port city of Kochi in 1503, was a modest structure at first, little more than a wooden palisade with a few cannon. But it marked something unprecedented, a European power planting a permanent military and commercial base on the soil of South Asia. The Portuguese had arrived in the region only 5 years earlier, led by Vasco da Gama, and they immediately recognized that the key to controlling the spice trade lay not in open seas but in fortified harbors. The pepper that grew in the hills of Kerala was the most valuable commodity in the world, worth more than gold by weight. Whoever controlled the ports where that pepper was loaded onto ships could set the price, dictate the terms, and grow rich beyond measure. The local ruler, the Raja of Kochi, initially welcomed the Portuguese as allies against his rivals and granted them permission to build a trading post. That post quickly became a fortress. Over the following decades, the Portuguese expanded the walls, added bastions, and constructed a church inside the compound. The fort became the hub of an entire network of coastal strongholds that stretched from East Africa to the Moluccas. From St. George, Portuguese governors launched expeditions to seize other ports, including Goa, which became the capital of Portuguese India, and Diu, which we have already seen as a choke point for trade. The fortress also served as a base for missionaries who carried Christianity inland, and for scholars who studied the languages and cultures of the region. It was a place where Europeans and Indians traded, lived, and sometimes clashed, but always under the shadow of those stone walls. For nearly a century and a half, the fortress of St. George remained a symbol of Portuguese power on the Malabar coast until the Dutch captured it in 1663 and renamed it Fort Cochin. The fort changed hands again and again, each new owner adding their own modifications, but the core of the original structure survived. Today, parts of the fortress still stand, including the bishop's house and the old church, visited by tourists who walk the same ramparts where soldiers once watched for enemy sails. But the significance of St. George goes far beyond its walls. It was the first link in a chain that would eventually encircle the globe. Every other European fort in Asia, from the Dutch in Goa to the British in Bombay and Calcutta, traced its lineage back to this small, sun-bleached outpost on the coast of Kerala. And as we have seen across this journey through 30 frontier fortresses, each one tells a different part of the story of how empires really expanded. Some were commercial engines like Fort Union and Goa that extended influence through trade and trust. Others were demographic seeds like Fort Dearborn that grew into cities. Some were defensive bulwarks that bought time like Castillo de San Marcos. Others were symbols of resistance and memory like the Alamo. Still others were instruments of cultural transformation like the Roman fort of Solberg. The fortress of St. George belongs to that first category, an economic foothold, a gateway for the flow of spices and silver that connected the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic world. But it also represents something more fundamental, the willingness of an empire to build a permanent structure on a distant shore and call it home. No fortress can hold an empire together forever. But each one, from the frozen ramparts of Suomenlinna to the star-shaped walls of Goryokaku, from the coquina bastions of St. Augustine to the log stockade of Fort Clatsop, left a mark on the landscape and on the people who lived within its shadow. The walls of empires crumble, but the patterns they set of connection, control, exchange, and sometimes loss continue to shape the world we live in today. And the next time you see a stone wall or a ruin by the sea, remember that it may have once been the edge of a dream, a fortress that held the line for an empire trying to hold back the horizon. That single stone fort on the Malabar coast was just one thread in a vast tapestry woven across continents and centuries. Every fortress we have explored, from the frozen Baltic to the humid Indian Ocean, from the limestone cliffs of the Mediterranean to the wooden stockades of the American plains, shares a hidden truth. They were never passive walls, they were engines, levers, and seeds. They did not simply block movement, they directed it, taxed it, and transformed it. They turned a river into a customs gate, a harbor into a monopoly, a mountaintop into a signal, and a prairie into a crossroads. The pattern repeats because the logic of expansion is universal. An empire needs a choke point to control. It needs a symbol to claim ground. It needs a hub to channel trade, and it needs a memory to outlast its own collapse. Whether the walls were made of coquina that swallowed cannonballs or of cottonwood logs that rotted in a single generation, each fortress was a statement written in stone or timber. It said, "We are here and we intend to stay," but the true surprise is how often the intentions outgrew the builders. The fortress that protected settlers became the city that forgot the fort. The trading post that turned a profit became the capital of a new nation. The fort that fell in a single battle became a rallying cry that inspired a movement. Human ambition organizes space through these structures, drawing lines on maps and driving stakes into the ground. And when we walk through the ruins of a frontier fortress today, we are not just looking at old stone. We are reading the fingerprints of people who dared to push the boundary of what they knew. They built walls, but those walls opened doors. They held the line, but the line kept moving. And in that movement, the world we live in now was shaped. If you enjoyed this journey along the edges of empires, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories hidden in the landscape, waiting for someone to look closely at the places where ambition met the horizon.